For decades, the history of ancient India between 1500 and 500 BCE was taught as a single, straightforward narrative. It was a story built entirely on one group of people, the Aryans, and derived entirely from their sacred Sanskrit texts. But relying solely on these texts left a massive blind spot. The authors documented only their own specific community, leaving the vast majority of the Indian subcontinent completely unaccounted for. Today, genetic tracking of paternal lineages and new analyses of ancient plant remains replaced those gaps in the record with a much more complex reality. Looking at this 3D map of the Indian subcontinent, we see that the early Aryan settlements only occupied one small northern pocket. Meanwhile, two other massive civilizations were developing at the exact same time, completely isolated from the north and from each other. To understand the true foundation of the subcontinent, we have to look closely at how these three isolated bubbles grew on their own, right before they inevitably collided. Let's start in the north, in a region the ancient texts called Ārya-varta. This was the territory where nomadic Aryan herders arrived and gradually established rule over the pre-existing settled farmers. This demographic visualization illustrates a striking genetic split found in the region. We can see that upper-class males still carry a remarkably high percentage of West Asian and steppe DNA. However, the female ancestry traces back almost entirely to the indigenous population. What this genetic data tells us is that while Aryan men married local indigenous women, they fiercely protected their status. They restricted access to their sacred Sanskrit language and their rituals, ensuring that only their direct descendants could hold authority. By tightly controlling both knowledge and genetic lineage, the Aryans engineered the highly rigid class system. It was a top-down structure designed specifically to prioritize their own priests and warriors above the rest of the population. Meanwhile, far from that Aryan stronghold, the Eastern Gangetic Region built a completely independent economy. It was an agricultural powerhouse driven by mass rice cultivation. This region was settled by a different group, known as the Outer Aryans. They spoke a natural, common language called Prakrit, rather than the heavily guarded Sanskrit. Crucially, they operated entirely without the strict Vedic priests of the north. Without a priestly class demanding expensive royal rituals, the culture here was free to explore different ideas. The East became a breeding ground for new philosophies focused on asceticism, the practice of giving up worldly possessions, and escaping the endless cycle of rebirth. It was in this environment that major historical movements took root, making the Eastern region the birthplace of ascetic traditions like Jainism and Buddhism. While Ārya-varta in the north was defined by strict rules and top-down rituals, the East offered a philosophical alternative that encouraged individuals to seek their own spiritual liberation. Finally, we sweep down to the Dravidian South. For a full millennium, while the North and East were developing their respective cultures, the South remained completely untouched by any Aryan language or influence. Here, tribal groups like the Gans flourished. Their way of life served as a living record, preserving the culture of pre-Aryan India. We know this because of archaeological evidence linking the South directly to the ancient Indus Valley civilization. Take a look at this 4,500-year-old bronze artifact from the Indus ruins, known as the Dancing Girl. When we compare that ancient artifact to modern Gond craftsmanship, we find the same complex lost wax casting method. The technique has survived intact across thousands of years of tribal history. This continuity extended to their religious practices. The imagery of horned deities from the ancient Indus Valley disappeared from the north, but that distinct religious symbolism survived exclusively in the traditions of the South. The South achieved its own organic integration from the ground up. Geographically isolated from the rest of the subcontinent, it successfully kept ancient tribal and Indus traditions alive. By the year 500 BCE, the borders of these three separate worlds finally met. The isolated development of the previous 1,000 years ended, as these populations began to physically and culturally compete for the first time. This collision was triggered by physical migrations. Northern Brahmins started traveling east to find wealthy kings to patronize their rituals, while Eastern Buddhist and Jain monks began walking west to spread their teachings. As these two northern ideologies clashed and expanded, they eventually pushed southward, bringing Vedic rituals and Eastern asceticism into the ancient, untouched Dravidian territories. This meeting forced northern Vedic priests to begin weaving Eastern concepts of rebirth and southern tribal traditions into a single, unified conceptual framework. This centuries-long effort to integrate these conflicting ideas is what ultimately produced the complex religious system we now call Hinduism.